She was more than a movie star. Elizabeth Taylor was a legend. But behind the diamonds, the fame, and the violet eyes was a woman who kept chasing something real. She married 7 times to 6 different men. Some were mistakes, some were passionate, and one she never truly got over. This isn't just the story of Hollywood's most talked about love life. It's the emotional truth behind the headlines, the obsession, the heartbreak, and the one man she said broke her in a way no one else could. These are Elizabeth Taylor's 7 marriages, and the love she truly regretted losing. Elizabeth Taylor was just 18 when she married hotel heir Conrad Hilton Jr. in 1950. MGM spun it as a dream wedding. She wore a stunning gown, gifts poured in, and the press called it a Cinderella story. But the fairy tale ended fast. Nikki was charming in public, but abusive in private, drinking, gambling, and lashing out. The marriage lasted only 9 months. Elizabeth, bruised emotionally and physically, filed for divorce. It was her first marriage, but already a harsh lesson: glamour isn't love. And behind the glitz, she was still just a teenager trying to understand what love was supposed to feel like. After Hilton, Elizabeth sought stability. She married British actor Michael Wilding in 1952. He was older, gentler, and gave her 2 sons. But the spark was never quite there. Wilding was low-key, Elizabeth was fire. While he liked quiet nights, she was drawn to intensity. As her fame soared, the marriage sagged under the weight of distance and mismatch. Wilding was kind, but not enough. In 1957, they divorced. There were no screaming fights, no scandal, just a slow drift apart. Looking back, Elizabeth called it a mistake made for all the right reasons. It wasn't tragic, it just wasn't true. Then came Mike Todd, the bold, brash producer who swept Elizabeth off her feet. They married in 1957, and it was different from the start. He adored her, challenged her, and gave her the passion she'd craved. With Todd, she laughed louder, lived bigger, and finally felt loved without fear or compromise. They had 1 daughter, Lisa, but just a year later, tragedy struck. Todd died in a plane crash. Elizabeth was shattered. She never recovered from that loss. In interviews, she called him the love I didn't get enough of. He didn't leave her by choice. And that made the heartbreak permanent. After Todd's death, Elizabeth turned to his best friend, Eddie Fisher, for comfort. He was married to Debbie Reynolds at the time. Their affair became a national scandal. Headlines screamed, "Homewrecker." Debbie was devastated. America was outraged. But Elizabeth was numb with grief, and Eddie made her feel less alone. They married in 1959, but their union, built on pain and escape, never stood a chance. She later said she didn't love him, she needed him. When she met Richard Burton just a few years later, it was over. Fisher faded. Their marriage was a scandal. But in the end, it wasn't even a memory she held onto. When Elizabeth Taylor met Richard Burton on the set of Cleopatra, everything else disappeared. Their chemistry was volcanic. They were both married. It didn't matter. The Vatican condemned them. The world watched. They didn't care. They divorced their spouses and married in 1964. It was love and war, lavish gifts, brutal fights, unforgettable performances. Burton gave her the 33-carat Krupp diamond. She gave him her entire heart. But their passion was too intense to last. They divorced in 1974. She later said, "It was like living in a tornado." But even the storm didn't keep them apart for long. 1 year after their divorce, Elizabeth and Richard married again. In 1975, they reunited, older, maybe wiser, still wildly in love. But the fire hadn't calmed. The drinking, the jealousy, the volatility all returned. They lasted less than a year the second time. But this time, the ending felt final. She later admitted it was a desperate attempt to reclaim something they'd already lost. Still, she never stopped loving him. When Burton died in 1984, Elizabeth was devastated. They had been apart for years, but he was still the center of her heart. She kept his letters by her bed until the day she died. In 1976, Elizabeth married U.S. Senator John Warner. It was a total shift, from movie sets to Washington, D.C., from diamonds to dinners with lobbyists. At first, she loved the quiet. But it didn't last. Warner was distant. Politics consumed him. And Elizabeth, used to passion and attention, fell into depression. She gained weight, withdrew from the spotlight, and eventually turned to addiction. She later described that marriage as one of the loneliest times of my life. They divorced in 1982. It wasn't scandalous, it was sad, the kind of slow fade that feels more painful than any public breakup. In 1991, Elizabeth married for the final time. Construction worker Larry Fortensky. They met in rehab. She was 59, he was 39. The tabloids went wild. But Elizabeth liked that he wasn't part of the industry. He grounded her. The wedding, held at Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch, was bizarrely fitting. They stayed married for 5 years. She later said Larry was sweet, uncomplicated, and kind. But the lifestyle difference was too big. They stayed friends after the divorce, and she left him 800,000 in her will. It wasn't a grand romance, but it was peaceful, and maybe that was enough by then. Of all her loves, Elizabeth Taylor admitted that Richard Burton was the one that never left her. Even after the pain, the chaos, the failure, they belonged to each other in a way no one else could touch. "There's never been a day I didn't think of him," she once said. They wrote letters until his death. In one of his last, Burton said, "You are the only woman I ever loved." She kept that letter close for the rest of her life. No matter how many marriages came after, it was Richard who haunted her, healed her, and hurt her the most. Every time Elizabeth married, it made headlines. But behind the headlines was a woman who wanted what everyone wants to be: loved, understood, and safe. The public devoured her drama, but they missed the grief, the loneliness, the desperate hope that each new husband might be the right one. She didn't marry for publicity. She married for possibility. And when it didn't work, she owned it. Elizabeth never pretended to be perfect. She once said, "I'm a very committed wife, and I should be committed too, for being married so many times." It was a joke, but it was also the truth. Even after all the heartbreak, Elizabeth Taylor never gave up on love. That's what made her rare. She didn't grow bitter. She didn't hide behind cynicism. She loved hard, fast, and fearlessly, every single time. She believed in soulmates, second chances, and fairy tales, even when reality kept crashing in. And that courage, to risk everything for love, over and over, is what defined her. Her marriages weren't failures. They were proof she was still willing to believe. In a world that judged her for it, she wore every scar like a diamond. That's the kind of legacy no scandal can touch. Elizabeth Taylor's love life was wild, but it didn't define her. She became a humanitarian, raising millions for AIDS research when no one else dared. She stood by her friends, fought injustice, and found peace in causes bigger than herself. Her greatest love, in the end, wasn't a man. It was the life she built on her own terms. Yes, she had regrets. Yes, she had heartbreaks, but she also had courage, joy, and a soul that refused to settle. Elizabeth Taylor didn't just live 7 love stories, she lived 7 lives. And in each, she never stopped being true to herself. Elizabeth Taylor's 7 marriages weren't just gossip. They were battles, lessons, and chapters in the life of a woman who refused to play small. If this story gave you a new view of the icon behind the legend, like, comment, and subscribe to Silver Screen Secrets. We uncover the real hearts behind the headlines, the pain, the passion, and the truths the tabloids never showed. Because some stars burn too bright to be understood in a headline.